As a mom, you know your home is where your family learns to love. It's the place for your little kids to learn who they are, and it's where your bigger kids remember who they were. It's where dreams come to life. Your home deserves a spotlight, and Everlights can help make it happen. Everlights is your permanent external lighting expert. Turn your home into a princess castle, a Halloween spook house, or a winter wonderland. You'll be the hero of your home. Let's give your home some color with Everlights. Click the banner for a free quote.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Laszlo Montgomery here with you again. This is the China History Podcast, and I thank you all for listening. Today, we're going to focus on the life of Wu Bingjian, someone much better known in the West as Hao Kuo. And like Muammar Gaddafi, he has a whole bunch of different ways to spell that name. But no matter how you spell it, we all recall Hao Kuo from past CHP episodes that mention the Canton system and the trade carried out at the port of Guangzhou during the 18th and 19th centuries. So hated was this Canton system. It ultimately led to the Opium War and many of the events of the treaty port era that so many today look back on with anger. This has all been mentioned in previous CHP episodes concerning the Qing dynasty, but today I thought I might dive a little deeper than usual and focus mostly on this one individual. Co-starring along with Hao Kuo are the British East India Company, the American Russell and Company, and the American partners of Hao Kuo, who all played oversized roles in the purchase, transport, and distribution of Chinese products in their home markets. When anyone speaks of China trade in the late 18th century through to the Opium Wars, well, we're mainly only talking about one single commodity. Yeah, China's other manufactures, porcelain and silk, were also exported, but overwhelmingly, all the action was in tea. And not until the aftermath of Robert Fortune's work in secreting China's long-held intellectual property and producing tea out of the country, every other commodity was a distant second place as far as where the greatest volume of trade occurred with the European and American trading firms. Nobody in China ever sold more tea than Hao Kuo. I don't think anyone even came close. And Hao Kuo's ancestors hailed from the land of tea, Fujian province. Hao Kuo himself was born in Guangzhou and lived there his entire life. But his family had migrated to Guangzhou from southern Fujian, from around the city of Quanzhou, which meant Wu Bingjian, a.k.a. Hao Kuo. He was a Hokkien Chinese. He was born in 1769 during the Qianlong era, when that longest reigning of Chinese emperors was in the early decades of his reign, for which most of his greatness is often ascribed. That was the same year James Watt received his patent for his steam engine that would go on to change the world. Hao Kuo's life story takes place before the treaty port era, and well before the days of Western nations imposing a kind of global order that made things easy for them to lord it over nations like China, lacking insufficient firepower to stand up to them. When waxing eloquent about the decades when China was the victim of foreign aggression, well, these years when Hao Kuo thrived were not among them. He lived before all that, when China called all the shots and foreign ships were begging for permission to trade there. Hao Kuo's people migrated to Guangzhou long before he was born. Genealogical records indicate the Wu family left their ancestral home in central China and settled in Fujian in the 12th century. We all know the 1100s contained a very traumatic few decades where many Chinese from the Central Plain escaped the chaos and uncertainty in the north and began anew in China's southern provinces. Life under the Jurchens and the violence that followed in their wake was unpleasant enough for many, like the Wus, to pack up and leave. And they prospered in their new southern Fujian homeland until the Kangxi Emperor in 1662, in order to deny the Ming loyalist Zheng Chenggong access to the China coast, instituted his Haijin sea ban, which forced everyone away from the coast and away from their livelihoods of fishing and trading. The Wus, being merchants who traded with ships calling on the port of Quanzhou, like a lot of their fellow Hokkien and Hokjiu, quit Fujian and headed in the direction of Guangzhou. This ancestor, who migrated to Guangzhou during the reign of Kangxi, was the one Haokua considered the Guangzhou branch of the family's earliest ancestor. In this sea ban and all the other measures taken by subsequent Qing emperors, it was fairly evident that they weren't too fond of foreign trade. They were a people of the forests and the mountains. The Manchus looked inward, not outward. If it were left up to them, they would have closed the country to all trade with all the seafaring merchants of the 17th century. But one thing conspired against the Manchus, and no matter how much effort they expended to keep them at bay, the foreigners kept coming. And the Qing government, despite all the efforts to limit interaction between these foreigners and the many southern Chinese entrepreneurs who welcomed them, it was like trying to hold back the ocean. There was too much benefit for the foreign buyer and the China seller. And as you know, if you listen to my History of Tea series, up to the late 19th century, after Robert Fortune stole the secrets of tea production and after the British got their tea industry up and running in the hills of northeast India, up until that time, China was the only place in the world where foreign traders could buy tea. Now, those lucky people stretching from Yunnan province in China all the way west to the Brahmaputra Valley in India had known about tea for more than 2,000 years, but China's tea masters in all the temples and villages in the east of China knew how to take those very same Camellia sinensis leaves that all the ancients were familiar with and turn them into a beverage. And people the world over, once they discovered this beverage, well, they went to great lengths to get it. For the Europeans, well, they didn't start learning all about tea until the early 1600s. It was a fashionable drink before it was a popular drink. And it took a century to scale up the business and turn it into a multi-million-dollar industry. On the Chinese side, they had to figure out how to scale up production on the supply side, and the Europeans, and others as well, they had to figure out how to transport the tea in sufficient quantities to satisfy the market demand back in their home markets. And the demand, once prices came down, was such that it became a matter of national importance. To the governments in London and Beijing, the tea trade was vital as a source of tax income. To the masses of people eking out an existence in mid-18th century England, it soon became the same necessity of life that it had been for the Chinese masses, going back to Lu Yu's time in the 8th century A.D. There had never been anything like tea before. It was a commodity as much as flour, sugar, and rice were commodities, and the demand was such that no matter how much tea got shipped, it would get sold, brewed, and drunk. And because of this insatiable demand in Britain and on the continent of Europe, the Qing court had no way to keep the gates shut in the Middle Kingdom. But they tried. The best they were able to do was control the trade. But by doing so, the emperor was getting in the way of the one thing that many engaged in commerce valued more than life itself, and that was money. Profits earned from buying and selling tea. In December of 1684, Kangxi's sea ban was lifted. Zheng Chenggong and his son had been defeated. The revolt of the three feudatories had ended in 1681. Guangzhou, along with a few other ports, for the time being, were thrown wide open to business. Though Guangzhou's history as a port went back to ancient times, as far as trade with the Western nations, the Hokkien who came from southern Fujian had a head start as far as dealing with the Europeans. They were more familiar at first with the nuances of selling to them. So when they began to arrive in Guangzhou in greater numbers, well, they helped the other traders there to up their game a little. Rice was the other mega commodity traded at Guangzhou, but foreigners didn't get involved in this business, which remained tightly controlled by Thai Chinese and transported by a vast network of Chinese junk vessels. The imperial court in Beijing mainly set their sights on Guangzhou and were intent on turning that port into a cash cow, bringing in revenue from the growing trade with the Westerners. The court created a new position called the Imperially Commissioned Superintendent of Revenues in charge of the trade and customs collection along the coast of Guangdong. And this official was better known in the history books as the Hapo. He served as customs superintendent and was the eyes and ears of the emperor. He had to funnel an endless stream of revenue to the imperial household as well as to the Board of Revenue. And one funded the imperial court and the other the state, and both were controlled by the emperor. The imperial court was counting on a nice income stream from the revenues raised at the port of Guangzhou. Traders who were privileged to do business there paid some very high taxes and indirect taxes. It was a lot more economical to trade at the smaller ports in Fujian and Zhejiang. Traders willingly went out of their way to buy their tea, silk, and porcelain at these ports for the sake of avoiding the higher costs of doing business in Guangzhou. After all, tea was tea, and it tasted the same no matter which port it was laden on board a cargo ship. The 1740s and 50s showed promise with so much trade being done in Guangzhou, but into the 1750s, revenues dropped substantially. And when Qianlong was informed about this, when he learned it was because of lower tax rates in Xiamen and Ningbo, well, he decided to act. Traders back then, and still today, they're always looking for better pricing. And one of the keys to getting the most competitive pricing is by having multiple sources to call on. By having alternatives, buyers can leverage the competition to get the best pricing. And if the merchants in Guangzhou couldn't be competitive, well, traders demanded the freedom to sail further up the coast to try their luck elsewhere. And the whole matter of free, unfettered trade was always what the Western trading companies wanted. The Qing court, they wanted the exact opposite. But in 1757, the Qianlong Emperor put his huge foot down and ordered all Chinese ports doing trade with the foreigners to pay the same duties and fees charged at Guangzhou. And faced with no competitive advantage by going elsewhere, foreign traders returned en masse to Guangzhou to load up on their tea and other wares. The emperor went one step further on December 20, 1757, by saying, in so many words, foreign traders could call at any port in China as long as it was Guangzhou. And that's really where the Canton system became the one and only option to buy tea in China. Everything was all about controlling the foreigners. The way one had to sail through the bottleneck of the Bogue or Tigermouth, the town of Humen, was a perfect way to regulate the flow of vessels to the port of Guangzhou. And by instituting the Canton system, the imperial court created a one-stop shop to not only deal with the foreigners clamoring for Chinese tea and porcelain, but also to remit all the revenues from this trade to the imperial court in Beijing. It all flowed from one single source. By the 1780s, the amount of tax revenue that flowed in the direction of Beijing was something that put a smile on the Qianlong Emperor's face. And by 1789, the revenue was in excess of 1 million taels of silver, and the income from foreign trade made up a major part of the overall revenues brought in by the state. As the 18th century came to a close, the trade in tea and other commodities was booming like never before. The British Commutation Act of 1784 really caused a sensation in the tea business. Smugglers along the China coast had been sticking it to the East India Company and their monopoly on all trade in Asia. They had always been around to cut into EIC profits and market share. So with a tax on tea equal to 119%, well, there was ample incentive for smugglers to find ways around the EIC monopoly. And as far as the Chinese were concerned, The smugglers paid the same top dollar that the EIC merchants paid. So Richard Twining, who was in charge of the great tea company founded by his grandfather, Thomas Twining, got together with William Pitt the Younger, and by an act of Parliament, the tea tax was slashed from 119% to 12.5%. And that effectively made legal East India tea competitive with smuggled tea. Besides that, it put the tea industry in England on afterburner. As you can imagine, a 106.5% reduction on the tea tax brought the retail price down considerably and put more cuppas in the hands of England's working stiffs and overworked moms. Yeah, 1780s and 90s, those were great years for the tea business, but they were nothing compared to the business volume of the first half of the 19th century. China was enjoying a last bit of sunshine before the roof caved in. The Qianlong Emperor, he reigned for too long, and rather than get China all prepared for changes, the likes of which hadn't been seen in 100 years, he allowed complacency to set in and prime the pump for what was to follow less than 4 decades after he met his demise in 1799. In 1775, the East India Company had less than a quarter of the market share of tea exports shipped out of Guangzhou. By 1793, they accounted for almost 80% of the tea exported. And once Napoleon met his Waterloo on Paul McCartney's birthday in the year 1815, Britain was never greater, and they came to utterly dominate the tea trade at Guangzhou. By the time of the Jia Qing Emperor, turn of the 19th century, the Qing imperial court was well aware that Great Britain was the most powerful and formidable of the Westerners calling on Guangzhou to trade, and they knew all about the East India Company as well, though they had no inkling about how badly they'll get manhandled by the British. Well, they knew early on to be wary of them. These were those days from the paintings we've all seen of the factories lined up along the Pearl River, flying the flags of Britain, France, America, and Denmark, right when the explosion in the tea trade was just happening. That's when a young 20-something Hao Kwa arrived on the scene. His father, Wu Guoying, founded the Yihe Company, but his role was more ceremonial than anything, and the real boss of the company was Hao Kwa's elder brother, Wu Zhongcheng, known in all the records from those times as Pui Kwa. That Kwa suffix that you often see in Chinese names from this era stands for the Chinese character Guan, which means government official. Hao Kwa in Mandarin is Hao Guan, and one of his names was Wu Hao Guan. In the Hokkien language, the Guan ends up sounding closer to Kwa. He had a cousin named Wu Guo Guan, who the Brits knew as Gyo Kwa. Anyway, older brother Pui Kwa ran the company, and Hao Kwa joined in 1788, and the two began trading with the EIC in 1792. That's when they first started showing up on the East India Company radar. They were small-timers, but they had sufficient capital to appear bigger in the eyes of their British trade partners than they actually were. And the EIC proceeded with them cautiously. Then Pui Kwa and Hao Kwa's Yihe firm decided to play the EIC game that called for them to agree to take made-in-England woolen goods at an agreed-upon exchange rate for a certain number of chests of different kinds of tea. Bohei, Congo, and Hyson, usually. Years before Hao Kwa entered the business, Chinese and EIC negotiators came to an agreement on how many piece goods of woolens would be accepted for how many chests of tea. The Chinese side didn't want these goods. They weren't easy to sell, nor were these woolens suited for their home markets. All Chinese traders had to put up with this, but the British had little else to trade, and offloading these woolen textiles, blankets, and garments was one way to mitigate the amount of silver they had to put up to complete the deal. To the Chinese, this was viewed as nothing more than a cost of doing business, and despite accepting these woolens as part of the deal, they still made off quite well. This isn't anything new for anyone. Part of the most popular narrative about why Britain and China clashed in the Opium War involved the dearth of British products that Chinese importers could sell in their markets. So Poiquat and Haoqua's Yihe firm performed admirably in the eyes of the EIC, and with that, they grew in esteem as a trade partner. As I mentioned just a bit ago, 1780s and 90s, trade was booming and demand for tea had skyrocketed. No matter how much tea Chinese merchants could bring to market, the EIC demand would absorb it. And when Poiquat went to the EIC and said he'd be happy to supply more product than their contracts called for, well, the British traders were thrilled. So getting in good with the British East India Company early on, demonstrating all the virtues in doing business that were expected of them, that was how Poiquat and Haoquat got their big break. Haoquat was invisible in these transactions. The British traders only knew Poiquat, and it was his name that they had faith in. By the fin de siècle, as 1800 dawned, business was booming, and the Wu family's Yihe Hang was enjoying a steep growth period at a time when most startups were scrambling to find enough cash to finance their business. But in that same year, the business took a massive hit when Poiquat got sick and had to step back from running the company. This is how Haoquat began taking over. And on July 23, 1801, Poiquat died. No big deal. Younger brother Haoquat was waiting in the wings and for many years had acted as the man behind the man. The succession was a smooth one. But over on the EIC side, all of their contracts and documents concerned Poiquat. So the get around to all this was for Haoquat to continue to do business with the East India Company under his deceased brother Poiquat's name. Everyone was fine with this arrangement, and that's how they kept it for almost 30 years. And at the end of the day, the only thing the EIC cared about was the creditworthiness and integrity of the man wielding the company chop. So Haoquat never let them down in that respect. Haoquat controlled the export market for Nanking textiles. I explained this before. Nanking comes from the city of Nanjing, thanks to the romanization efforts of Wade and Giles. J's were written as K's, and hence Nanjing was pronounced Nanking. And in the world of textiles, Nanking was a smooth, breathable cotton fabric that was special because of its pale yellow or beige color of the undyed material. The cotton fibers weren't bleached, so this Nanking color was simply the natural color of the cotton, and it really caught on in the 16 and 1700s, and besides garments, it was used for bed linens, curtains, and as an upholstery fabric. It was quite popular, and the term Nanking sort of became a brand for this type of look. And in time, textile producers the world over started weaving Nanking cloth. Anyway, Haoquat didn't corner this market, but he did specialize in it. And where quality, price, and most importantly, trade financing were all concerned, nobody competed with Haoquat. This Nanking textile business was one of the other commodities Haoquat and the East India Company engaged in. Although there were more than a dozen hongs or companies that were licensed to do business with the Western traders, the EIC only worked with the 2 or 3 biggest. The Kohong of merchants had been abolished in 1771, and just because there were now more players than ever to do business with, well, the EIC still valued trust and reliability over all other factors. EIC management had always had their way when dealing with Poiquat. At a time when the Wu's Yihe Company was trying everything to get some traction and achieve high growth, Poiquat had said yeah to anything asked of him by his British trade partners. Haoquat wasn't so accommodating and was no less hard-nosed and professional than the EIC negotiators. The Honorable Company, now at the height of its formidable power, couldn't dictate business terms to Haoquat. And enough business had been transacted and enough credibility had been established by then, such that the EIC had grown dependent on Haoquat's reliability. Into the 1810s and 20s, the EIC was mainly dependent on Haokua and fellow trader Lu Guanheng, better known as Mokua, for all their tea and Nanking business. No matter how dependable they may have been, well, no one wants to be wholly dependent on so few sources to supply them with goods. Therefore, the EIC management tried to develop more Chinese hongs in the expectation that one day they would grow and rival Haokua and Mokua's companies, thereby offering the EIC more competitive prices. That was how it was supposed to go in theory. Well, having all these chicks in this incubator they were managing was an expensive enterprise for the EIC. And though they did what they were supposed to do to develop their business with these new firms, the reality was that they had to borrow from Haokua to finance this idea of theirs. And these small traders who the EIC was grooming to become big traders one day, well, culturally were more loyal to what Haokua asked of them than their British bosses. So Haokua, he probably had a bit of fun helping the British out with this idea. In 1812 or 13, Mokua died. He was second only to Haokua, so with his passing, the EIC was in crisis mode with respect to their China business. All this time, through the period when Puiqua was alive, and the same with Mokua, Wu Bingjian, Haokua, he always operated low-key, never wishing to hold the mantle of leadership. And now with Mokua gone and no halfway decent family heir waiting in the wings to take over, greatness was thrust upon Haokua, and he became the openly acknowledged top trader in all of Canton. And he was certainly the largest supplier of Chinese manufactures and tea to the EIC. They were utterly dependent on Haokua for their commodities trade, as well as for being able to finance the immense volume of commerce they carried out.
The best time to get permanent Everlights for your home is right now. You'll get the best price of the year. You'll get installed quickly. And with Everlights, you'll have the brightest and longest lasting lights year-round. Show your colors for the 4th of July, for your team's game day, and you'll beat the Christmas rush. Best thing is, no ladders or installer takedown for years and years to come. Everlights is your everyday lighting solution for your home or business. Click the banner for a free quote for the year's best deal.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
In 1814, Haokua was officially sanctioned by the government in the names of the Hapo and the viceroy of the Liangguang, the two Guangs, Guangdong and Guangxi, as the top merchant in Guangzhou and all the ceremonial and fiduciary responsibilities that meant. In the meantime, Haokua's main business, selling tea and Nanking fabric to the East India Company, maintained a steady turnover in business volume. Haokua knew, and the EIC knew, and Haokua knew the EIC knew. Without him, it would be a disaster for the honorable company. They had performed admirably in shooing away their fellow European competitors from the China trade. French and Dutch traders still called on Guangzhou, but their share of the overall trade volume had shrunk to an insignificant number. Those two, they had their own things going on in Vietnam and Indonesia. The East India Company was making a gross profit in excess of 50% on the trade they carried out with Haokua in China. It was, and always had been, immensely profitable. Like it was with most manufacturers at the source and the middlemen like Haokua, they made much less profit, in the single digits even. By the 1810s, Haokua, after more than a decade at the helm of his company, had amassed quite a pile of cash. Most of his money was plowed into Guangzhou real estate, rice fields, businesses, and other investments. But there was quite a bit of unused capital lying around, and seeing how the East India Company, at this stage of the business cycle, was chronically low on cash, Hauqua was only too happy to get into the lending business. To finance the trade that involved a firm like the British East India Company, with all the guarantees that came with their name, carried very little, if any, risk. So Hauqua was able to create two solid income streams: profits from trade and interest earned on trade finance. Lending was more profitable than exporting tea and Nanking textiles, and with customers the likes of the East India Company, Hauqua faced a lot less risk. And he not only funded the EIC, he was also the banker to all these other hongs that the EIC had been trying to grow so that they might one day pose some competition to Hauqua. But into the 1820s, tea was still, by a landslide, the biggest article of trade at the port of Guangzhou, which, according to the rules of the Canton system, still in force in 1757, had a monopoly on where foreign merchants were allowed to carry out trade. And the biggest foreign merchant engaged in the tea trade was still the EIC. And Hauqua was their biggest supplier, as well as their private banker. And the British East India Company, for all the power they wielded from their monopoly on China trade and all their political connections and centuries of experience, they were unable to use this power against Hauqua. He always had the upper hand. Back when I was in the game, in the 1990s, customers like Walmart, Staples, Li & Fung, well, they wielded a huge club, and factories like the ones I worked for, they had to bow and scrape to make them happy and keep the business. No such thing for Hauqua. No matter what the EIC higher-ups thought of him, they never crossed him. They weren't loyal to him by choice. They were loyal to him because of their dependency on his trading connections and his cash pile that he lent to them at 1% per month. Hauqua, on the other hand, wasn't so loyal. He saw where the future was, and early on in 1807, he began to dabble in business with American merchant traders. The first ship from this new country, the USA, arrived in Guangzhou in 1784, right after the nation was formally established. Now, in the 1810s and 20s, the Americans were showing they had what it took to be a player, and Hauqua decided to be of assistance to them. Hauqua's American business is a story involving one extended Boston family. It all began with Thomas H. Perkins, a merchant in opium and slaves. Like the more famous John Jacob Astor, Perkins was one of the first to buy animal pelts in the Pacific Northwest and unload them at unimaginable profits in China. When opium became a huge import in China, Perkins engaged in the smuggling of Turkish opium into China to compete with British opium from Patna in India. He had a nephew who he adopted as his son, John Perkins Cushing. Perkins sent young John Perkins Cushing to Guangzhou to work at his office there. By the time he arrived, the one managing the trading office died, and at the tender age of 16, John Perkins Cushing found himself in charge of the operation. He became a partner in Perkins & Company, and on behalf of his uncle and adoptive father, John Perkins Cushing, he engaged in all the main commodities of trade in China, opium most of all. Later in 1830, after 24 years in China, turning his firm into one of the trading powerhouses doing business in Guangzhou, John Perkins Cushing returned to the States, and prior to leaving, he merged his company with the other leading firm of the day, Russell & Company. Hauqua caught sight of young John Perkins Cushing early on, and he particularly liked that he was Guangzhou-based and not living far away. So despite the language and cultural barriers, he began to develop and cultivate this relationship. And like he did with the East India Company, Hauqua made himself indispensable to Cushing and most of the American traders he did business with. The Americans, like the British, engaged heavily in the opium business. By the 1820s, the damage this narcotic drug had wrought on Chinese society was already evident. The Jia Qing and Dao Guang emperors had tried and failed to outlaw this scourge, but to no avail. It was a very sensitive matter, and with all the opium gushing into China through the port of Guangzhou, Hao Qua was always suspect. He never engaged in the trade of opium. Being suspect meant he was always in a position, in the eyes of Chinese officials, of being guilty until proven innocent. Therefore, he went to great lengths to ensure that all of his accounts were clean and no invoices for opium sales could be traced back to him. By not engaging in the opium trade, Hao Qua missed out on huge business opportunities. His American partners had a separate entity that dealt in the so-called foreign mud, and the arm of the company that did business with Hao Qua was clean of that taint. Proceeds from selling opium, however, were used to buy Hao Qua's tea and Nanking woven goods, and this example of Hao Qua's involvement in the opium business was tenuous at best. He played it very carefully and managed to avoid being hauled back to Beijing in chains to face justice. By the 1820s, Cushing had sold off his opium business to Russell and Company and got out for good. Hao Qua was able to enjoy a seamless transition of leadership after Cushing returned to the U.S. In his place came John Murray Forbes. He and Hao Qua, also lacking a common language other than pidgin English, became close comrades. They maintained a lifelong trust in each other that defied the realities of the kinds of betrayals between business partners that are so commonplace wherever greed percolated beneath the surface. As he had done for the British EIC, Hao Qua also became a banker to the American trading firms. And aside from lending, Hao Qua's other main business, one built completely on trust, was in financing the consignment of tea and other goods to buyers in the U.S. Up till then, all trade had been on a Maiduan basis, buying and selling at sight, money exchanged for goods. And under this new consignment business carried out with Americans like John Murray Forbes, to complete the transaction might take months or even a year before Hao Qua got paid for goods sold to his American partners. But for financing the whole deal, there was additional income earned on the interest. And no one ever deviated from the script, and whatever dust-ups there were due to quality or some other grievance, it got handled. After Forbes returned to America in 1837, he was replaced by his brother Bennett. The relationship that started first with John Perkins Cushing and then with John Murray Forbes continued with a third partner to Hao Qua. Not only did these men faithfully carry out an honest business with Hao Qua, John Murray Forbes acted as his fiduciary in the U.S., investing Hao Qua's money and acting as a steward to all the assets he held in the U.S. market. Hao Qua was never a partner in Russell and Company, nor did he own any shares in the company, but they were dependent on him for their survival. And going in the other direction, they treated Hao Qua well. Their perfect little world received a shock in 1839 after Lin Zexu burned all the British opium at Humen on June 3rd of that year. And with all the battle drums being sounded and British warships converging on and blockading Guangzhou, this was very bad for business. And as Hao Qua approached his 70s, more and more he began to prepare for his ultimate demise and what to do with all the massive amounts of wealth he had accumulated. More and more he exposed his family to his partners and familiarized them with his sons. With all the disruption to business and communication during the Opium War, Hao Qua began to panic about the safety of his assets. Everything hinged on the trust and friendship he had forged with these three Americans, Cushing, John, and Bennett Forbes. They could have absconded with his great wealth any time they wished, but they never did. The riches owned by Hao Qua, it was not chump change in the least. It's been stated over and over in so many articles that at the time of his death, Hao Qua was the richest man in the world. As Hao Qua began his 8th decade, his own health began to fail. with the ink dry on the first of many unequal treaties to follow. It was a new era in China. The Bainian Guochi was now in full swing, and with the Canton system abolished and the treaty port era having begun, Guangzhou's future as an important trade entrepot faced a number of challenges. The Forbes brothers, concerned for Hao Kua's safety and well-being, tried to convince him to quit China and move to Florida, to St. Augustine. Wu Bingjian, Hao Kua, well, he died on September 4th, 1843, a little over 2 months after the effective date of the Treaty of Nanjing. He was spared having to witness China's indignity during the treaty port era. Hao Kua outlived most of his sons, and it fell upon the fifth son, Wu Chongyao, to become Hao Kua's sole heir. And this son, well, he wasn't one of those profligate types who burned through the inheritance left to him by his father in a single generation. He stepped into his father's shoes as far as the relationship went with the Forbes brothers and Russell and Company. But the son was by no means equal to his father in business and how he conducted himself in his relationships with his father's most trusted partners. He didn't do much to grow the wealth and seemed content to simply continue on with trade finance. The Yihehang name, which Hao Kua had spent a lifetime building up, ended up being usurped by Jardine Matheson. Through carelessness, the firm's name, which also served as the company brand, had been left unprotected and there for the taking. And in the eyes of the Chinese, the Yihehang brand, thanks to Hao Kua, meant something. But during the last decades of the 19th century and into the 21st century, this name has been indelibly associated with the multinational conglomerate Jardine Matheson. And under the Jardine's corporate umbrella today are the firms Jardine Pacific, Jardine Motors, Hong Kong Land, Jardine Strategic Holdings, DFI Retail Group, Mandarin Oriental Hotel Group, Jardine Cycle and Carriage, and Astra International. And with the Canton system finally abolished in the aftermath of the Opium War, the importance of that great city became very much diminished. We'll never know what Hao Kua would have done, but as far as his son was concerned, Wu Chongyao, he put all his eggs in one Guangzhou basket, which, in the long run, turned out to be a huge mistake. Wu Chongyao, also known as Young Hao Kua, disengaged from the world and in time repatriated all of Hao Kua's overseas wealth back to China. And John Murray Forbes is known mostly as an early railroad magnate and made a fortune in this business. Ironically, most of Hao Kua's substantial wealth held in America was invested in railroad bonds, and it was no small amount either. So in a way, we could say not only did the Chinese help build the transcontinental railroads, in Hao Kua's case, they helped finance their construction too. He also bought American Treasury bills, and after his death, Forbes had used Hao Kua's money to buy Civil War bonds to help fund the North against the South. By the 1860s, Hao Kua's son had burned through most of the assets held in Russell and Company, and what remained was all lost when the firm went belly up in 1891. After Hao Kua died, China went from one political and social upheaval to the next, not least of which was the Taiping Rebellion. Through a combination of greedy local, provincial, and imperial officials with never-ending demands for money, and due to bad investments and the cost of living in such tumultuous times, that pretty much soaked up most of Hao Kua's great wealth. As I said, the supposed $26 million estate he left behind when he passed in 1843 made him the richest man on the planet. That's several $billion in our day. And I'm betting Shorty, my man in Eganstown, would be able to tell you about the Hao Kua River located in the Alpine region of the Australian state of Victoria. It's thought that this river, famous for fly fishing and camping, was named after Wu Bingjian. For a while, at least, Hao Kua haunted Madame Tussauds Wax Museum in London. His likeness was later joined by Empress Dowager Cixi and Li Hongzhang. I don't think they're there anymore. I can't say for sure. I didn't visit Madame Tussauds when I was in London last month. Well, you've all heard of him, and now you know who he was. The definitive book on Haokua's life, I assure you, was Dr. John D. Wong's Global Trade in the 19th Century, The House of Haokua and the Canton System. The book came out in 2016, Cambridge University Press, publisher. Dr. Wong is an associate professor at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences at the prestigious University of Hong Kong. Used to live down the street from there. I'll have a link at the website. Okay, that's all I got for you there. All of you who have asked me over the years to cover this topic, I hope you're leaving the table full and satisfied. I thank you all for listening. This is Laszlo Montgomery signing off as usual from the City of Night. Please consider joining me next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.
As a mom, you know your home is where your family learns to love. It's the place for your little kids to learn who they are, and it's where your bigger kids remember who they were. It's where dreams come to life. Your home deserves a spotlight, and Everlights can help make it happen. Everlights is your permanent external lighting expert. Turn your home into a princess castle, a Halloween spook house, or a winter wonderland. You'll be the hero of your home. Let's give your home some color with Everlights. Click the banner for a free quote.